Good morning. So, as promised, the Ignition and Axis integration project is finally ready to rock and roll. This project has been done for a little bit, but that's all right. We're gonna put this video together real fast. So, this project contains several aspects to it, all of which took a fair bit of time. But those being the Ignition perspective, the Python Flask, the MySQL server, and the Axis Apache API along with its components to get the desired functionality. So this is going to be a longer video to try to cover all the aspects of this project. I will do my best to be concise, but this is still going to take a little bit because there's a fair bit going on here. So let's get into this. So I wanted to start with the Ignition perspective session and showcase all the functionality. So let's take a look at that in general and see how it's communicating and what you can do. So you punch in the credentials for the camera, and so I'll talk more about that later, but basically login for the camera needs to match the login that's stored in the database, which needs to match the credentials stored in the environment variables for the server. But anyway, punch all that in, we get our live feed, and so we can move it because it's trying to focus on the camera. That here. Let's go this way. Yeah. So we can move the camera up, down, go back to the home position, move it around, all that good stuff. Right now it's tracking. So yeah, basically live feed now works as anticipated. I have a slight delay built in right now. I think it's 0.005 seconds. So pretty much nothing, but you can amp that up to slow it down a little bit for high latency, low bandwidth networks, which is kind of overall increased performance because all these are just JPEG images, right? Over here, request the videos. These are all the current recordings that exist right now. And so this looks like me just leaving my room and closing the door. And then it pans, and then it's done. Cool. So we have the ability to live stream the camera feed. We have the ability to pull in recordings. And so this is a HTTP 206 call, so it's polling as necessary. That's why you can only see as it's kind of going. So then we go over to the admin. So there's two separate sections for this. One is a higher elevation, the camera, and then one is a lesser elevation, the ignition. This section determines who has access to the project, right? So in other words, who has access to this stuff, whereas the camera has implications to who has access to the cameras. So that's hence why it's higher elevation. So this should maybe be its own project or have just an admin section off to the side, but regardless, it's in here because this is not the first iteration, but this is more of a demo than anything else. So we can make and remove users. So it was designed more for something like this. So it'll check to see if the username exists. So we can just do, I don't know, sure, 2, 3. Save. User is created. Cool. So we go back, go to the admin, go back to Ignition. Look at that. There he is. He's got the test company and the looking glass role. Fantastic. So if we have him selected, we can remove him. He's gone. Cool. This one's a little more complicated. So I'm just going to remove him for right now. So every user is going to be associated with camera RTSP URLs. So the RTSP URL is what allows you to interact with the server, which then interacts with the camera. And so generally there would be two users, one that has PTZ privileges and the other that does not. So in other words, one that can just one that can just see the camera and the other that can move and see the camera, and also change other configurations like the home position, for example. And then ideally change the position in which it can scan for movement as configured in the ignition, or not the ignition, the Axis camera. So if we go and we add a new user, we can do, we'll just do Mr. Hehe again. User has been added. Go back over here, go back to camera, fantastic. So we can also remove him if we want to, or we can add a camera for him. So if we go in here, this is the Axis site that you can get all of the RTSP URLs off of to do your streaming. So if it just had an HTTP, you can just interact with it directly without the server, but generally it would be ideal to use the server. Anyway, so we can add a different one here. Camera's been added. Go back over this guy. He's got his new camera. Fantastic. And if we want, we can select this and remove camera. Just get rid of that. Cool. So that's the general functionality that exists in here. And so all of that is obviously in the Ignition device and code itself. So all of these are just functions to interact with the camera, to either send or retrieve requests, but mostly to send. And all of these will do what they say. So this one, all of this has to do with moving the camera. All of these camera user management has to do with managing the cameras. The database user management has to manage the Ignition project. View Protect just determines who can have access to which pages and who doesn't. And so, for example, if we look at the Go Up button, right, it's just a URL with the right endpoint, API endpoint that we want. And then the actual configuration for where it's going for the server is controlled over here. So it's all just local right now, but for example, if the when the server's deployed in, say, Azure, for example, if you made an Azure virtual environment and you got it all set up with GUnicorn and Let's Encode for all of that stuff, so it's secure and also has load balancing and all the other things that it's going to need, you can change this to be the right IP with the right port, and then also the protocol would be HTTPS because you're going to want it encrypted. So that's just a very brief overview of everything that's in here. So if we go and look at so now that that's done, though, we can go look at everything else that makes the system run specifically in the back end. So we're going to take a look at the Flask server, and then we're going to take a look at the database. So the Flask server is massive. It's like 560 lines of code. This took a very long time, but that's okay. So everything that's in here is configured to have multiple sessions, all to be stored in the database, which I will show you. And so it's all configured to both use the database and then also use the environment variables to both interact with the cameras and also the database. So this means that you have enhanced security because all of the credentials for the users are tucked into the environment variables, so you can't get at them unless you have access to the server, which is good. But this means that every time you want to add a new user, you have to restart the server. So for example, if you had somebody that came to you and said, I want 3 cameras, and you made the 2 users, the one that can move it and the one that can't, you're going to have to add those users into the environment variable, restart the server, and then they should be able to access that, assuming that you've followed all the other protocols that are along with this. So it does increase general overhead, but I would argue it's better for security than just having constant security calls thrown everywhere. So this is the actual server. So it is a lot, but I won't bore you with all the details in here. I just want you to know that it acts as a piece of middleware where it allows the Ignition system to integrate with the camera properly, so you can still see everything, control it, and do all the other things you need to do. Think of middleware just as a piece of, like a support beam that stabilizes the overall design of your house. You need it to increase stability and general structural integrity. This is the same kind of principle. So additionally, one of these endpoints. So for example, you have the video feed, which is the one that gives you the main video feed, right? It doesn't really matter, but all of these are RESTful endpoints that call the Axis camera and then communicate from the camera that's on my desk with the PC that's on my desk. This is all just through a network switch. So we can go, so all of those calls, for example, are done using the Axis API. So all of this is the video streaming one. You go in, you configure it, you make the right calls, and you got a video stream. It took a fair bit of time to comb through some of that stuff, and that's okay. Now we're going to talk about the database, because none of this is possible without the database. So let's take a look at this. So this is where the magic happens, right? So if we look, for example, we added this HeHe user. Well, this is an old call. We can pull new rows. So for example, these are all the pro users who have usernames, password hash, because I have it all configured in the server. They can both view the camera and they can both move the camera properly. And then these are the companies that they're associated with, because you need to know the company that's going to be in the ignition system also needs to link up with the company that's on the user. So you have to make sure that all those roles are put into the gateway first before you start doing anything else. But that's alright, because it's generally it's easier to make sure that everything's role based, because the roles allow you to segregate like the actual project itself. For example, LG, I called it Looking Glass, so you can determine who's in which project for which thing, or you can determine who has access to what, and so on and so forth. So it's a fairly efficient way of doing that, I've found. It does mean that you're going to have a lot of roles, but it also means that every one of those users is then categorized properly. So it has its ups and it has its downs. But every one of those sessions that is live, for example, is going to be stored in here. So if you remember, I didn't end the session. That was over here, right? Each one of these have an active session over here. But if I go and make another session in my other browser here, we now have two sessions, both active, both functional, both being able to move. So this is generally why you want only one user. You want one user to view and one user to view and move. So because if you have multiple users trying to move cameras at the same time, the camera does not like that very much. I was kind of messing around with that a little bit ago, and it was not content with that, but that's okay. So one user, one person, handful of people know, the other people get the just base stream for the camera. I think it works pretty good. So now that we've covered that, we can go and take a look at the actual Axis configuration page. And so that is over here. So I'm just going to bring all this over here. So these are all the users. So every user that is stored in this camera has to have the same username and password that's stored in the database, which needs to have the same username and password that's stored in the environment variables. All of those have to link up, because if they don't, you won't be able to populate it properly, so you won't be able to get the right calls, and then you won't be able to see what you want. So it's a bit of a problem, but you do need to have all of them in the right order. But additionally, the actual setup for the camera to do, for example, the tracking and recording, that's where you get the recording videos that I was showing you, all that is configured in here. So it's under these apps, which are, you have Axis PTZ auto tracking and Axis motion detection. And so both of these together you can use to create events in your system that then allow you to move the camera properly. And so it will be over in the events section, and you set up all the rules: record, return, track, right? And that's all done in here. So basically what it's doing is it's looking for any movement in this box, which is the whole camera. So if you wanted to set it up differently, you could make it so that it was only tracking, say, this top corner as opposed to the whole screen, right? So you got that option as well. But with all that being said, that covers the project. That covers the Ignition Perspective project, that covers the Flask server, that covers the databasing, and it covers the Axis API and all of its components that make this project run. So that concludes our brief demo of this camera. Obviously, I didn't cover everything because there's a great deal going on in here, but if you have any questions, you're more than free to ask me. But that is the conclusion. And so before I go, I'll leave you with just a fun fact about the camera that has nothing to do with the project. I just think it's cool. The camera itself actually has 32 optical zoom, which is just, I don't know why, but to me that's just so cool. So I thought I'd leave you with that, but thank you for spending this time with me and enjoying the demo, and goodbye.